Professor Chomsky, I'd like to press you a little bit further about the way in which effective democratic control would be achieved consistently with discharging the necessary functions of such a society. If you suppose that there would continue to be a need for self-defense on quite a sophisticated level, I don't quite see from your description how you would achieve effective control by the system of part-time representative councils at various levels from the bottom up over an organization as powerful and as necessarily technically sophisticated as, for example, the Pentagon, which is a body with which you've had quite a long record of conflict over the Vietnam War and other matters in recent years. Can you describe how the Pentagon could, at one and the same time, be efficient as a defense organization and nonetheless properly responsive to democratic control within the United States if it was an anarchist society?
Well, first we should be a little clear about terminology. You refer to the Pentagon, as is usually done, as a defense organization. And in fact, I remember very well in 1947 when the National Defense Act was passed that established the current system of war making, the former War Department, the American Department concerned with war at that period, up to that time, was honestly the War Department, and it had branches. And its name was changed in that act to the Defense Department. And any sophisticated person, and I was a student then and didn't think I was very sophisticated, but I knew, and everyone knew, that this meant that to whatever extent that the American military had been involved in defense in the past, and partially it had been so, this was now over. Since it was being called the Defense Department, that meant it was going to be a Department of Aggression, nothing else.
The principle of never believe anything till it's officially denied.
Right, sort of on the assumption that Orwell essentially had captured the nature of the modern state. And that's exactly the case. I mean, the Pentagon is in no sense a Defense Department. It has never defended the United States from anyone. It has only served to conduct aggression. And I think that the American people would be much better off without a Pentagon. They certainly don't need it for defense. I think its intervention in international affairs has never been, well, never is a strong word, but I think you would be hard put to find a case. Certainly it has not been its characteristic posed to support freedom or liberty or to defend people and so on. That's not the role of the massive military organization that is controlled by the Defense Department. Rather, its tasks are two, both quite antisocial. The first is to preserve an international system in which what are called American interests, which primarily means business interests, can flourish. And secondly, it has an internal economic task. I mean, the Pentagon has been the primary Keynesian mechanism whereby the government intervenes to maintain what is ludicrously called the health of the economy by inducing production. That means production of waste. Now, both of those functions serve certain interests. In fact, dominant interests, dominant class interests in American society, but don't think that they in any sense serve the public interest. And I would think that this system of production of waste and of destruction would essentially be dismantled in a libertarian society. Now, one shouldn't be too glib about this. If, let's say, if one can imagine, let's say, a social revolution in the United States, that's rather distant, I would assume, but if that took place, it's hard to imagine that there would be any credible enemy from the outside that could threaten that social revolution. We wouldn't be attacked by Mexico or Hawaii or something like that. Well, it's part of the United States, Cuba, let's say. An American revolution would not require, I think, defense against aggression. On the other hand, if a libertarian social revolution were to take place, say, in Western Europe, then I think the problem of defense would be very critical.
I was going to say, I mean, it cannot surely be inherent in the anarchist idea that there should be no self-defense, because such anarchist experiments as there have been have, on the record, actually been destroyed from without.
It's not, yeah. But I think that these questions cannot be given a general answer. They have to be answered specifically relative to specific historical and objective conditions.
It's just that I found a little difficulty in following, before the break, your description of the proper democratic control of this kind of an organization on the basis that the defense organization itself would become some kind of workers' cooperative.
And I wouldn't say
because
that.
I find it a little hard to see
No,
the
that's
generals
no.
controlling themselves in a manner which you would approve of.
Well, that's why I do want to point out the complexity of the issue. It depends on the country and the society and that we're talking about. In the United States, one kind of problem arises. If there were a libertarian social revolution in Europe, then I think the problems you raise would be very serious, because there would be a serious problem of defense. That is, I would assume that if libertarian socialism were achieved at some level in Western Europe, there would be a direct military threat, both from the Soviet Union and from the United States. And the problem would be how that should be countered. That's the problem that was faced by the Spanish Revolution. There was direct military intervention by, well, really three-pronged, by fascists, by communists, and by the liberal democracies in the background. And the question how one can defend oneself against attack at this level is a very serious one. However, I think we have to raise the question whether centralized standing armies with high technology deterrence are the most effective way to do that. And that's by no means obvious. For example, I don't think that a Western European centralized army would itself deter, say, a Russian-American attack to prevent libertarian socialism, the kind of attack that I would quite frankly expect at some level, maybe not military, at least economic.
But nor, on the other hand, would a lot of peasants with pitchforks and spades.
We're not talking about peasants. We're talking about a highly sophisticated, highly urban industrial society. And it seems to me its best method of defense would be its political appeal to the working class in the countries that were part of the attack. That's part. But again, I don't want to be glib. It might need tanks. It might need armies. And if it does, I think we can be fairly sure that that would contribute to the possible failure or at least decline of the revolutionary force for exactly the reasons you mentioned. That is, I think it's extremely hard to imagine how an effective centralized army deploying tanks, planes, strategic weapons, and so on could function. If that's what's required to preserve the revolutionary structures, then I think they may well not be preserved.
If the basic defense is the political appeal, or the appeal of the political and economic organization, perhaps we could look in a little more detail at that. You wrote in one of your essays that in a decent society, everyone would have the opportunity to find interesting work, and each person would be permitted the fullest possible scope for his talents. And then you went on to ask what more would be required, in particular, extrinsic reward in the form of wealth and power, only if we assume that applying one's talents in interesting and socially useful work is not rewarding in itself. And I think that that line of reasoning is certainly one of the things that appeals to a lot of people, but it still needs to be explained, I think, why the kind of work which people would find interesting and appealing and fulfilling to do would coincide at all closely with the kind of work which, as it were, needs to be done if we're to sustain anything like the standard of living which people demand and are used to.
Well, there's a certain amount of work that just has to be done if we are to maintain that standard of living. It's an open question how onerous that work has to be. Let's recall that science and technology and intellect have not been devoted to examining that question or to overcoming the onerous and self-destructive character of the necessary work of society. The reason is that it has always been assumed that there's a substantial body of wage slaves who will do it simply because otherwise they'll starve. However, if human intelligence is turned to the question of how to make the necessary work of society itself meaningful, we don't know what the answer will be. My guess is that a fair amount of it can be made entirely tolerable. It's a mistake to think that even backbreaking physical labor is necessarily onerous. Many people, I included, do it for relaxation. If it's under our own control, part-time and so on. Well, this weekend, for example, I got it into my head to plant 34 trees in a meadow out behind the house, for example, from the State Conservation Commission, which meant I had to dig 34 holes in the sand. Well, that's, you know, for me and what I do with my time, mostly pretty hard work, but I have to admit I enjoyed it. I wouldn't have enjoyed it if I'd had work norms, if I'd had an overseer, if I'd been ordered to do it at a certain moment, and so on. On the other hand, if it's a task taken out of just interest, fine, that can be done. And I think that and that's without any technology, without any thought given to how to design the work and so on.
I put it to you that there may be a danger that this view of things is a rather romantic delusion entertained only by a small elite of people who happen, like professors, perhaps journalists and so on, to be in the very privileged situation of having jobs in the sense that they are paid to do what anyway they like to do.
That's why I began with a big if. I said we first have to ask to what extent would the, let's call it the necessary work of society, namely that work which is required to maintain the standard of living that we want. First question is, to what extent need this be onerous and undesirable? That's an unknown question, I think, much less than it is today. But let's assume there is some extent to which it remains onerous. Well, in that case, the answer is quite simple. That work simply has to be shared. It has to be equally shared among people capable of doing it.
And beyond spends a certain number of months a year working on an automobile production line and a certain number of years collecting the garbage. And
if it turns out that these are really tasks which people will find no self-fulfillment in. Incidentally, I don't quite believe that.